On today's episode of Big Time, the podcast, brought to you by the Landscape Supply Center, our buddies out there, the Russo brothers out there in Herman, Maine, big time supporters of this show. Speaking of big time, you know what's big time? Today's show, we've got an absolute legend on Big Time today. We've been trying to make this happen for a while now. We've got Terre Carpenter, former soccer coach for Fort Kent Community High School, and the one who's credited for bringing soccer to Fort Kent itself. On today's episode of Big Time, let's go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Big Time, the podcast. We've got a very, very special guest today. His name has come up on a lot of the episodes with some of the guys we've spoken to in the past. Today we have Terre Carpenter on the line. Terre, how are you?
Not too bad, Tom.
And Terry's coming from where? You're down in the Portland area, correct?
Right, we live in South Portland.
South Portland, all right. So as I mentioned, Terry's name has come up a whole lot, and so we're going to kind of find out more about him. So I think most people would know you for your stint in your background with soccer in the Fort Kent area, correct?
That's true.
Okay, so we're going to go a little bit further than that. So I want to find out more about you. So where are you actually from, born and raised? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Holton.
Okay, so you're a Shire.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what time frame did you come up with? What was your childhood? What was the time frame in which you grew up in Holton?
Well, I was born in Holton, but I lived about 12 miles north of there in Monticello for the first 17, 18 years of my life. And went to school in Holton and graduated from Ricker College, and then later on from the University of Maine at Orono. I had a master's degree from there in English. I was an English teacher in Fort Kent.
Okay, so that's how you eventually got to Fort Kent. But I'm kind of curious your athletic background, because a lot of the guys I've spoken to, you were part of their athletic background, and when they were coming up, you were kind of one of their biggest influences. So when you were growing up, what did you guys have for sports at the time? I'm guessing baseball was the big thing when you were growing up.
That's pretty much it. Baseball was what we did most of the time. Soccer was something I learned in college, and I took what I learned up to Fort Kent and went there originally to stay 1 year because I wanted to teach in Holton. But they didn't hire any first-year teachers at that time, so you had to have at least a year's experience. So I had a friend that had been up at Fort Kent Community High School the year before I went there. He was from Holton also, and he loved it up there, but his wife was from New Jersey, and she wasn't particularly thrilled by being in Fort Kent, if you know what I mean.
Not too many people are.
So he only stayed the 1 year, and so I went right up and took his place, figuring that I'd stay there for 1 year and then go back to Holton to teach. And I ended up my whole career right there in Fort Kent. I loved the town, loved the people, and it was just a match made in heaven, I guess.
Yeah, so I'm curious because, I get it from a lot of my friends that have gone to Fort Kent or the University made at Fort Kent, and, basically they just want to do their time and get out of there. And you kind of mentioned the same, you only had the intention of going up there for a year, but you're from the county as well. So what's the biggest difference, like in your eyes? Why did you only want to go there for a year? How much different is Fort Kent from Holton, both being county towns? What was the difference, and why were you only trying to be there for a year?
Yeah, well, I'd probably say that the difference is in the people. They're much more friendly in Fort Kent and outgoing, and Holton's a little bit, people are a little bit guarded, a little bit, I don't know how to exactly put it. They're not real open.
Okay.
And so I like the people in Fort Kent. I like the kids. The kids were great in Fort Kent, and it worked for me.
So whenever you were going to school, you mentioned you went to Ricker College, correct? And Ricker was
Right,
in
right.
Holton, correct?
Right.
What was Ricker College like? Was it a small school? How long was it around for? Because I've heard the name, but I'm not too familiar with how long it was open for. Was it kind of like
Yeah, it wasn't around a whole long time. I think it closed its doors in the 70s sometime, and it was just a small town college, and had mostly local people that taught there, and it was a nice place. It was it was something like University of Maine at Fort Kent when I first went up there in 1963. There were a lot back then. They were a lot like Ricker College, was a small college, pretty intimate setting.
Was it more of a teacher's college?
Yeah, a lot of kids that went there came out as teachers. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what was your original intention? Was your intention all along you wanted to be a teacher and you wanted to coach sports, or did you have other ambitions growing up as a kid in Holton?
Well, I wanted to be a sportscaster.
Okay.
I was thinking about going to Emerson College down in Boston or someplace like that, but I guess my parents talked me out of it because they said that there wasn't much use for, you're gonna have a hard time to find a job if you go into a field like that. So I settled for second best. I settled for being a teacher and a coach, and I'm glad I did because I enjoyed both. I enjoyed the teaching part, and I especially enjoyed the coaching part because I coached 3 sports at Fort Kent.
Okay. So you mentioned broadcasting. Were you listening to games on the radio growing up as a kid? I'm guessing that's all you guys really had in the county was just on the radio, correct?
Yeah, that's true. That's how I heard my baseball games on the major league level. That's all we got in the county was Kurt Gowdy and Ned Martin and people like that were announcers for the Red Sox.
So were you all about listening to the games, reading the newspapers, following the Red Sox that way? Were you pretty diehard fan growing up?
Oh yeah, I've been a fan since 1946.
Okay. Who was your favorite player growing up?
My favorite player growing up was probably the guy you never heard of.
Okay.
His name was Billy Goodman. He was a second baseman for the Red Sox, and I played second base when I played baseball, and he was about my build and size, and I really admired the things he did. He died of cancer in the 60s. He didn't live a long life, but he was a good player, and one year he won the batting championship. Actually, he took over. He was a substitute, and he took over at mid-season for Ted Williams. Ted Williams broke his elbow in the All-Star game, and Billy Goodman took over full-time in left field and won the batting championship that year.
Wow.
And so he was probably my favorite. Ted Williams was the best player on the team, but Billy Goodman was my favorite.
So you mentioned your parents kind of, maybe not so much talked you out, but kind of convinced you out of going for broadcasting just because it would have been tough to find a job around the area. What was the sports coverage like growing up in terms of like high school sports? Was there any coverage at all in the papers, or how was it done back then?
There wasn't a whole lot. I don't know if you ever heard of Dewey DeWitt, but he announced the basketball games in Aroostook County for almost, everybody in northern Aroostook would remember Dewey DeWitt because he was the sportscaster for most basketball teams in the area, especially Presque Isle and Caribou and Fort Fairfield, Holton. And so he was he was one of the people I looked up to, because I was real interested in that sort of thing. And I did do a little bit of announcing. Lon Courier owned a radio station in Madawaska when I first went there, and so I used to do the basketball games for Madawaska High the first 2 or 3 years I was there.
See, you mentioned, in particular Northern Maine basketball, and when I think of Holton, I think basketball. Did you guys have a basketball program when you were going through, or was that a little bit afterwards?
No, there was a basketball program there, but it was when I was in high school. It was so long ago that the girls' teams were made up of 3 forwards and 3 guards.
Wow. A little bit different.
And the forwards played only on offense in one half of the court, and the guards played only defense in the other half of the court. And so when you finish guarding your girl or whatever, you passed, or you got a rebound or whatever, you pass the ball into the other court, and those 3 girls would play offense against the 3 guards in the other half of the court. And it was crazy. It was a crazy deal.
Yeah, it does not resemble today's game at all. A lot different back then.
Not at all. No, in no way. No.
So you went to Ricker College. What year did you graduate from Ricker?
1963.
And then from there it was on to the University of Maine. You said, did you go right away, or did you take some time off before going to University of Maine?
I've taught for 6 years, I think. Yeah, 6 years. In 1969, 1970, I got my master's degree.
Okay.
In English at UMO. Yeah.
And is that where you said you got introduced to the game of soccer?
Well, at Ricker also.
Okay, Ricker. Okay.
Yeah.
So Ricker had soccer, but it wasn't being played at the high school level at that point, right?
No.
So
no.
This is
no,
what
there was very little soccer in the state of Maine back then. Most of it was concentrated down this area: Gorham, Scarborough, Falmouth, Yarmouth, Freeport, Portland a little bit, and that was where the most concentration of soccer teams, high school teams, were.
So I'm curious as to how soccer kind of got integrated into the rest of the state, especially Aroostook County. I'm guessing the county was probably the last schools to start forming soccer programs. So do you remember what that process was like? Was it just kind of like schools started sprouting up here and there and getting teams together, or was there like an actual effort
I think it probably started at Limestone, because a lot of the base personnel that came in there, this was when Loring was at its peak of activity.
Yep.
And so there were a lot of kids who had played soccer in foreign countries, that shipped in there and wanted to know why Limestone didn't have a soccer team. So I think they started it. And, of course, they were right next to Caribou, so Caribou picked it up, and Prescal picked it up. And I think we were probably the 4th team to pick it up. When I went to teach in Fort Ken, fall of '63, there was no soccer team in Fort Ken. We started it the following year.
So what was the actual process to get the soccer program started? I'm guessing obviously you needed a soccer field, so finding the space for that was one thing. And then what else was involved to actually get the program off the ground?
Well, you had to have some competition. So we started out, there were 4 teams. There were Caribou, Prescal, Limestone, and us. And really there were only 3 teams before we started. We started in '64, and that we made the 4th team, and that's pretty much the competition that we played.
So
just each other.
Yeah, a very, very, very small schedule. Only like 6 games maybe, or did you guys play them more than once?
Yeah, I think there was one other team. If I remember right, it was Washburn. Believe it or not.
Wow.
That was the 4th team. So we played an 8-game schedule the first year. Yeah, first year I taught we We played an 8-game schedule. It was the only losing year I ever had as a coach.
The first year.
We were 3-5 that first year. I can remember that well. And then after that, we took off, and kids loved the sport, and pretty soon we were a dominating factor in Brewster County soccer.
So was the original soccer field the one that's still there? Was it out behind the high school? Has that always been the soccer field?
No, our original soccer field was St. Louis Field, beside right across from the Catholic Church on Main Street.
Really?
And it was a softball field in the summer.
Yep.
And of course it was flooded in the spring.
Yeah.
By the Fish River, and that's where we played. We marked off the first soccer field ever down there. Played our games right on that field, and then a little bit later on, we went up behind the high school.
Yeah.
And made a field up there, but that wasn't for 3-4 years. For 3-4 years, we played down at St. Louis.
So I'm curious about a couple of things in the beginning here, because obviously whenever you introduced the program, there had been no soccer ever before that. So you had people literally picking up a soccer ball for the first time in their life as high schoolers. So my first question about getting the program off the ground is, what was that like? So how do you even go about introducing a brand new sport to a bunch of high schoolers and expecting them to compete? Like, what was your approach as the coach?
Well, I pretty much had to start from scratch because not many of the kids knew anything at all about soccer. So we had to really concentrate on the fundamentals, the dribbling and the passing and the position on the field. And I can remember our early practices and everything in games. Everybody ran toward the ball, instead of playing a position on the field, they were just playing the ball.
Yeah.
It was kind of messy there for a couple of years, but we got our act together, and they came along quickly because they're smart kids, and they got the idea of you don't always play the ball, you play your position on the field, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
And so it was a grind to start, but they picked it up quickly.
And then you also you picked up the sport late as well. I mean, you didn't really get introduced to it until college, and I'm guessing the game of soccer was played a little bit differently back then compared to what you see now. Obviously now a little bit more tactical and possession and stuff like that. So
it's a lot different. Yeah.
Okay, so what was the style of play? Yeah, what was the style of play like that back then?
Well, they usually had 5 offensive players. You'd set up in a 5-3-2. Your defense, you only had 2 fullbacks and a goalie, and your 3 midfielders, or your halfbacks, and you had 5 linemen. You had an inside right, an inside left, and a center, and 2 wings on the front line. And so it was really geared mostly to offense,
Yep.
Much more so than today.
And then for you as well, I'm curious, as a coach, obviously you kind of adapt and you learn as you progress, maybe take things from different programs to different coaches. How did you kind of evolve in the beginning? Because the game was also kind of brand new to you. So were you learning from other people? Were you watching other programs? Like, how were you kind of going about in terms of your style and developing how you wanted your team to play? What was that growth like for you in the beginning?
Well, when I first started, I used to read a lot of books on soccer, and as much as I could, I watched it because back then you could get European soccer on TV every once in a while, and so I'd watch those games pretty carefully and read some books about soccer, and I got my ideas pretty much from that.
And then the The last question I kind of had about getting the program off the ground was what kind of reaction did you get from the community? I mean, I'm guessing for a lot of the people in town, they had never seen soccer before, especially some of the older folks. So what was the reaction like from the community? Did they kind of rally around the soccer program right away, or did it take some time for them to kind of buy into it?
No, they rallied around it pretty quickly. We didn't get big crowds at first because nobody knew what it was, you know, and most people that came to see us came out of curiosity, you know. They just wanted to see what all the fuss was about, and so eventually, when we played in the first state championship game, I think that was the late '60s. We had a tremendous contingent of people who got down from Fort Kent all the way to Bowdoin College to watch us play Gorham in that very first state championship. And even though we lost, we didn't really lose. The final score was 1-1. But back then they had no way of going to overtime or anything like that. So they tallied up the corner kicks that you had during the game. Whoever had the most corner kicks ended up the winner. So even though the score was 1-1 at the end of the game, we lost because Gorham had more corner kicks than we did. But I can remember when we came back to Fort Kent on the bus, geez, we had a tremendous outpouring of people like alongside the roads, and they were honking horns and everything else, and really, made us feel like we were winners instead of losers, you know. And it was just a great place to have a soccer team and have the fans back them, you know.
What year did you guys make it to your first state championship?
Well, it was the first one in the state of Maine. See,
okay.
No one had ever. Soccer was so small back then that there was only a concentration in Aroostook County of 5 or 6 teams,
yep.
And in the Portland area, probably 8 or 10 teams down here. And everybody thought that we wouldn't have a chance against teams down here because they'd been at it for so long, and we held our own. Of course, Bob Netto was our goalie then, and I really didn't know how good Bob was because most of the year he'd just leaned against the goalpost in Fort Kent because we were hammering people left and right, you know. And we hadn't lost a game. We were 16-0 that year, and he just didn't have much action, you know. I didn't know how good he was. And we got down in that game against Gorham, and we found out that he was a superstar. He was, well, the UMO coach got him after the game to go over to his car or whatever, and they talked about him going to the University of Maine at Orono and playing goalie, which he did.
Wow.
And he was a good one too. But he just shined in that game. You know, Bob wasn't that big. He was probably 5'9" or 5'10". Usually your goalies are bigger than that, but geez, he just had a super game in that game against Gorham, and he got a scholarship out of that, I think. I'm pretty sure he did.
You mentioned Bob, and shout out to Bob. He's the one that made this happen. He's been the one in the background getting me connected with you. So I want to thank Bob for making this happen. Who else were some of your standout players, or some of your better players from those earlier teams when you first started out?
Oh, we had some great players there. Glenn Lamar, who's dead now. He died of cancer a few years back, and he was a tremendous athlete in all sports. He pitched for Edmundston in the Maine New Brunswick Baseball League, and he was a great basketball player, and he was a good soccer player for me too. And then Tommy Pelfsey from Fort Kent, he went all the way to Brown to play soccer, and I can remember I wrote a letter to the coach at Brown and told him I had a kid in Fort Kent that was a real good soccer player, and he wanted to go to Brown because he wanted to be a lawyer eventually. And the coach kind of blew me off because he figured Fort Kent, Maine, how good could a kid from there be? And so Tommy went to Brown, and he got on the soccer team as a walk-on because the coach didn't offer him anything or seemed to show any interest in him. And after about a year playing at Brown, the coach called me up one day at school, and he said, "You got any more like that up there?" I said, "Oh yeah, I got all kinds of them." But Tommy ended up being a captain for Brown, I think, the last 2 years of his stay there, and he was a real good soccer player. And the coach found out that you could have good soccer players from northern Maine,
Absolutely. So this would have been Tommy and Glenn would have been the early 70s, right?
Yeah.
And then you guys kind of had a string of success throughout the 70s and making it to a couple more state championship games, correct?
Oh yeah, we eventually we played in 5, and that was when there was only one class of. Today there are like 5 classes or 4 classes of soccer, but there was only one class. It didn't make any difference whether you came from a big high school or a small one. You were in just that one class. So, the times we went to the state championship, it was always against I remember Scarborough, the year we played them at University of Maine at Orono, they bought three busloads full of players. Just players. It looked like an army came out on the field,
Yeah.
I told the kids before we started, I said, "Hey, only 11 of them can play at one time, so don't worry about it." But I mean, they were stocked. They had a lot of. That was before football. Scarborough had no football team then, and so all their athletes played soccer, and they looked scary coming off the buses. But
who were some of the teams in the county that you guys were battling? I know, you guys had a great string of success, throughout the 70s in that time frame. But were there any teams that you guys just had constant battles with year after year, or was it pretty much all one-sided during that time for you guys?
Probably our biggest rival over those years was Madawaska.
Okay.
They started a year or 2 after we did.
Yep.
Their coach, Mark Michaud, he was on the University of Maine at Fort Kent team that I helped coach because Lowell Osgood coached the team. He didn't know anything at all about soccer, so that was the first year I was in Fort Kent.
Yep.
He found out that I had played before and everything, so he got me to help him coach that fall. And I think one of the players he had on his team was Mark Michaud, and Mark ended up at Madawaska teaching, and so we had some good battles.
Was there a rivalry between you and Mark? Were you guys pretty intense, heated rivalries? Did you guys get into it at all on the sidelines?
Yeah, we've been known to get into it a little bit.
I'm curious as to what your coaching style was like. Were you a fiery coach? Were you pretty vocal or laid back? What was your style?
No, I was pretty fiery on the sidelines there. I'm pretty passionate about the game, and I used to hoop and holler quite a bit.
So you were the type? Were you working the referees and giving them an earful and letting them know how you felt?
Well, if they didn't do a good job, I would.
That's a good answer. I like that. So Madawaska was a good rival. How about the in the county? We think nowadays it's Prescott, Caribou, Holton, schools like that. Some of the larger schools. What was it like back then? Were they competitive games versus those teams as well, or were those teams you guys kind of handled?
We pretty much handled those teams real well. I remember one year Caribou had a real good team because at the end of the year they invited me down to their banquet following the soccer season because they'd gone pretty far in the state playoffs, and they wanted me to speak on behalf of the soccer team down there, so I went down. And every once in a while Prescott would have a pretty good team, but mainly Fort Kent was the dominant team all the way through the 60s and 70s and first part of the 80s too, I guess.
And then you were teaching throughout that time at the high school, right? The entire time you were
right.
coaching as well, right?
Right.
What subject did you teach?
What subjects did I teach?
Yeah.
Did you say?
Yeah.
I was an English teacher.
Okay.
I taught, and for a while, until I got too busy with sports, for a while I was head of the English department there in Fort Kent for a few years. But then I got so that I was coaching 3 sports, and you didn't really have time to be a department head and coach 3 sports, so I gave up the department head because I enjoyed the sports so much more than that part of it, you know.
Yeah, I got a question in regards to if you had some of your players in your class. Were you easy on your players in the classroom and kind of let them skirt by, or were you tough on them in the classroom?
No, I tried to teach that. Tried to be equal to everybody, you know. I didn't have any favorite. Of course, I had favorite players,
Yeah.
but I tried not to let that bleed into the teaching part of it, you know.
So what was the tenure in which you coached soccer? You started in the 60s, and when did you get all done coaching at the high school?
1988.
Oh, so you were there. So you were there for almost 20 years.
I coached soccer there for 24 years, from 64 to 88.
So you mentioned Glenn Lamar and Tom Pelletier, and then I'm guessing after that it was Carl Labby was probably another one of your better players, correct?
He was a great scorer. Yeah.
Did he like to pass the ball, or was he all about scoring, that Carl?
Well, Carl he was, you know, if somebody else was open and he had a chance to, because a lot of teams double teamed him.
Yeah.
When he was playing, because he was such a magician with the ball, you know, he could get around one man, but if you put 2 on him, you'd have trouble, you know. So when that happened, he would pass the ball, but score too, you know.
Yeah, so that Carl would have been more the late 70s. So at that point, you had been coaching for for about a decade.
Around the mid 70s, I think, Carl.
Yeah. So at that point,
76.
At that point, I'm curious. I mean, you know, by the time he came around, you guys had success. You'd been there for over a decade as a coach. What was the biggest difference you noticed, or the biggest change from when you first started to kind of when you guys were rolling to the mid 70s? I'm guessing you weren't spending as much time introducing the game to people. At that point, the kids coming up had kind of played throughout their childhood. So what was the biggest difference from when you first started to the mid 70s when you were rolling? I'm guessing, like, you know, you could focus more on other things instead of the basics of the game.
Yeah, well, I think probably the biggest thing that helped this was we had a summer league.
Oh, okay.
Where the kids could play soccer in the summer. That started sometime in the 70s, and I ran practices back then. Coaches could run practices year-round if you wanted to, but I would run the summer program just like the high school program, so they were getting actually 12, 15 more games every year than other schools were, because they didn't bother with summer programs, you know. So I thought the summer program helped us a lot in the 70s and early 80s.
Did you guys have a youth program as well? Was there stuff for the younger kids at that time frame?
Well, we had soccer in the elementary schools there, but it was a tough go because the elementary schools were from all over. You know, they had one in Eagle Lake and St. Francis, and those schools didn't get a chance to participate too much in the sport. You know, so really we ended up being a big school, but we were only drawing athletes from Fort Kent generally. Once in a while we'd have a couple of guys from Soldier Pond or Eagle Lake or maybe St. Francis, but for the most part, the bulk of the kids came right from Fort Kent, where they had played in elementary school, you know.
Yeah. And then also, you mentioned how whenever you guys would get to the state game and you start playing some of these schools from downstate and just, they were bigger, they were stronger. I'm guessing the style of play was different as well. Um, did the teams up here kind of evolve as well? And did the style of play change a little bit? The longer you were the coach, did you see things? I'm guessing just overall the play improved. I'm guessing the players got more talented, and it all just kind of evolved as well that way, right?
That's true. Yeah, yeah. And we early on in the late '60s, I kind of figured that the kids were, they looked at the Portland area and they thought, boy, these people are a lot better than we are, and so I decided to do something about it. I had an uncle that lived in Falmouth, so during potato harvest one of those years, I came down to Falmouth High School and I talked to the athletic director and the coach, and we started a series where the first year we took our kids down to Falmouth to play a couple of games with them, and then the second year they'd come to Fort Kent and be sort of a cultural thing.
Yeah.
And so it worked real well. We did that for 10 years or so, and then it started to be a point thing where you have to calculate the points and everything for the games, and the wins and losses started to mean so much more, and they stopped playing us. But we did continue to play. We played other schools. We played Kennebunk, and we played Scarborough, and we played Gorham, and the kids found out that soccer down here is not that much different than what we played up there, and they were able to realize that, hey, we can compete with these people, and so they did.
So you mentioned that you coached into the 80s as well. I'm more familiar with the 70s teams. My father played for you, so I've heard the stories of those games. What were your teams in the 80s like? Did you guys continue to compete at a high level throughout the 80s as well?
Yeah, we did. We were right there for the whole time I was there. We were there. We were always in the playoffs, and depending on how strong our team was, we went either to the state game or bowed out in Eastern Maine somewhere. But we ended up winning 5 Eastern Maine championships. And
who were some of your better players in the 80s?
Oh, in the 80s, let me see.
Did Stevie Perro play for you?
Yes, he did.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. Yeah. I know Stevie. I'm trying to think of some of the other names that would have played for you during that time frame.
Yeah, I had hard to remember. I had so many kids in the programs, it's hard to remember, separate them by decades.
Right.
I had some Plord kids that played. The family came up from Connecticut, moved back to Fort Kent, and they played down there. And there was Danford Plord and Dana Plord and some of those kids that were real good players for me also.
Were you involved with? I know you mentioned Coach Osgood and the UMFK team in the beginning. He kind of asked you to help out just because he had no idea when it came to soccer. Didn't really know much. Were you involved with the UMFK teams at all besides early in the beginning?
No, just that first year, because after that we had our own team at the high school, so
right.
I couldn't help him out. So the fall of '63 is the only year I worked for him. And they played where the Fort Kent, University of Maine of Fort Kent dining room is now. That's where the field.
That used to be the soccer field. Wow.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you mentioned that you were coaching 3 sports at one point. So were you the soccer coach, basketball coach, and baseball coach?
I coached baseball and soccer and girls basketball.
Girls basketball, okay.
Yeah.
And were you the coach for all three? Coach for all three sports?
I was a little reluctant to take that job because I didn't, I'd never coached girls before.
Yeah.
And there were no girls in my family, and so I didn't know if I'd know enough about girls to do that job or not. But I ended up. I loved the job. I loved the competitive nature of the girls, and we had some good tournament teams in those days, and so I really enjoyed that part of it.
So were you the coach for all three sports during the entire time you were the soccer coach, or did you kind of pick up some of those things later on? Because I'm guessing
I picked up baseball with about 10 years left of my time in Fort Kent, so it was late 70s to 88, and I picked up the girls team a couple of years before that, so I had them for about 10 or 11 years.
So you mentioned 88 was when you hung it up. When you decided you'd had enough and was ready to put down the whistle.
Yeah. I up until 88, everything was fine, and I enjoyed everything I was doing. But I had been at it for so long and devoted so much time to it that by 88 I was pooped. So I decided to change jobs, and I came down here and I worked out at Scarborough Downs for 22 years.
That's a nice change of pace right there.
Yeah, well, I've always liked harness racing and horses, and the job just appealed to me, and I ended up selling tickets at Scarborough Downs.
See, you mentioned in the beginning when we first started talking that your original goal was to come up here for a year and get out and do something else. But you mentioned what kind of kept you around was the people in the community. You just liked the tight-knit feeling of Fort Kent, right?
I did, yeah.
Were you involved in other things in the community as well, besides teaching and coaching? Was there anything else you got into during your time in Fort Kent?
Well, I did quite a bit of fishing and hunting up there, and we had a bowling team at the high school, and I enjoyed that.
Did you bowl in Canada as well?
Yeah, that's where we bowled. That's where the lanes were.
Did you at all during your time as a bowler? Did you ever go up against the Labby brothers? Did you ever go up against arms and legs on the bowling lanes?
We did.
Yeah. Were they as good as they say they are?
They were very good bowlers. I can remember that.
And then also something else I wanted to ask you about is I've heard stories that you were a basketball player as well, and that there was a group of the older gentlemen in Fort Kent who used to play basketball at the middle school, I believe it was. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So who were some of the guys that you played with back then?
Larry Otterberry used to play back then, and George Pooler, and hard to remember. Most of the kids that had graduated from high school and were back in Fort Kent, they would come. Men's night. We had a couple of nights a week. I think we played in that men's league, and it was a lot of fun.
Did you play with Fran Berthium as well?
Oh yeah.
What were those games like? Were you guys pretty competitive old men, or was it more just for a good time?
Oh no, we were competitive. We took a team. Riviere de Loup had a tournament back in the 60s, and they invited some of the schools or some of the towns from northern Maine to take part in the tournament.
Yeah.
So we took my car, and I had 5 guys with me, and the 6 of us went up there and played in a tournament and won it.
What was the?
That tells you the state of basketball.
I know, right? What'd you guys?
Quebec
Did you guys
at
get
that
a
time.
you guys get a big trophy out of that, or what was your reward for winning the whole tournament?
Yeah, we got a trophy.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you obviously enjoyed your time in Fort Kent, and then as you said, left in '88, and you've been in Scarborough ever since, correct?
Right.
You haven't done any coaching since then. When you left Fort Kent, that was it.
No, that was it. It's the only place I ever coached.
I'm guessing you
I
probably
really enjoyed it.
I'm guessing you've probably gotten into a couple Hall of Fames then since then. I'm guessing you've been inducted into a couple things.
No, not really.
Nothing.
No.
Huh.
Nothing.
Maybe
Well,
it's coming.
Soccer's not a big sport, in the United States because it's just never caught on. I think the reason is there's not enough scoring. The better the soccer is, the fewer scores there are, in the game.
Right.
Like you watch that English league, and a lot of the games end up 0-0 ties or 1-0 wins, and I don't think Americans like games in which there isn't a lot of scoring.
Yeah, I think America likes their action junkies. They want to see high-scoring games. They want to see points on the scoreboard, and it's too bad because soccer really is a beautiful game, especially if you understand it. It's fun to watch. I'm guessing. So I'm guessing you still watch plenty of soccer even to this day.
Oh, I watch that English Premier League all the time. Yeah, I really get into that.
Are you getting into the Women's World Cup? It's going on right now as well here.
Yeah. Yeah, I watch the women's game. They do a lot better than the men. There's no question about that.
That's for sure.
But soccer's a great game to watch. And
how else are you keeping yourself busy nowadays? Are you still working at the track, or have you retired from there as well?
No, I retired from the track too. I had enough of that after, I think it was 73. I was 73.
Yeah.
So that was about 9 years ago. I got done there, and now I'm just a sports junkie. I watch the Red Sox, the Celtics, the Bruins, the soccer teams from England, whatever's on TV for sports. That's where you'll find me.
Do you still follow the Fort Kent teams at all? Do you follow them in the paper?
Oh yeah. I went up to Hamden the last time they played for the state championship up there, and I came over to Scarborough when the girls were down here for the state championship. So whenever they're in a state championship, I usually find my way there.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you. So you mentioned
a lot of my old friends, some of the kids that played for me. They've got daughters on the team that play, or sons on the team that play. And
yes,
I enjoy that.
That's something I was going to ask you. Do you still have some of your former players that you kind of keep in contact with, or you mentioned you bump into them at soccer games and stuff like that? So I'm guessing you're still in communication with a lot of your former players.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of them live around here,
Yeah, I feel like everyone's heading south. Everyone, you were ahead of your time. You got south before everyone else caught on to it. Now that's what everyone's trying to do now. So you were ahead of your time with that decision. But you mentioned. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned that you were there for when the boys won their state championship games. So that's something I wanted to ask. So as a coach, you guys got to how many state championship games?
We got to 5.
You got to 5 state championship games as a coach, and
that's when there was only one class.
One class, and had some tough defeats. What did it mean to you when you were there when Fort Kent brought home their first state championship in soccer? Did you feel part of that, or did it bring back any feelings for you being able to see that?
Oh yeah. I was so happy for the town and the kids on the field and everything. Yeah, great. They won it. Yeah, I brought back a lot of memories watching those games.
Absolutely. So we have a couple different segments that we do on the podcast here, and I got one in particular I wanna ask you. So the title is it's not as serious as what the title may seem, but the title of the segment is called "When You Die, What Jersey Do You Want to Be Buried In?" So I'm wondering if there's one particular team that you coached that means the most to you. If you could bring one team with you to the grave, which one would that be?
Well, I think it would be that first state championship team. That would be in '68 or '69. I can never remember which. That's the team Bob Netto was on, and Glenn Lamar, and one of the Johnson boys, Rick Johnson. And I remember that game like it was yesterday.
That's the one that ended in the corner kicks you mentioned?
Yeah, that's the one that was undefeated and lost on corner kicks, 1-1.
That's a tough way. That's a tough way to lose, especially in a state championship right there.
Yeah, well, of course they didn't know much about soccer, the State Principals Association, so they didn't want to have to stay to because those games could go on forever, you know.
Right.
And they didn't want to have that happen, so they made the rule before the game started. I think they just told us about it before the game started, that if this game ends in a tie, whoever has the most corner kicks will win the championship.
Yeah,
so that's how it ended.
And I'm curious. So, like, obviously, as a coach, that's a tough way to take a defeat, especially in the state championship. At any point, because I know you kind of built the program in Fort Kent itself, and you had a lot to do with the growth of soccer up there. Were you involved in trying to progress the rules along? Because I mean, obviously, that's something that it's still not done that way to this day. Games aren't decided by penalty kicks. So, you know, on being on the losing end in a game like that, at any point, were you trying to like push rule changers or just help kind of grow the high school game at all across the entire state level at all?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, the way that the soccer programs all over the state are run today is because of work that I did in setting up. They wanted classifications after that first 2 or 3 years when there was just one class. So they asked Cliff Burkett, who was a principal at the high school at that time, if he would contact me to help them set up the A, B, C, and D classes for soccer. So what you see today is pretty much what I drew up. I got the list of all the schools and all their students, and sort of broke them down into classifications A, B, C, and D, and that's the way it is today.
And that's for all sports. That goes for soccer, basketball, baseball, softball.
Yeah, of course they had them for the other sports before that.
Okay.
See, they had, because those classifications go all the way back to, I don't know, the 40s or the 50s.
Okay.
But they didn't have one in soccer, and they asked Cliff to do that, and he came to me, and I set up the whole thing. It took me a long time because a lot of schools in the state, you know,
yeah.
and almost all of them were playing soccer on some level, you know, and so I was instrumental in helping set up that whole system.
So that leads me to my last question. I'm curious what you're most proud of. Is it the impact you've had, you know, that's felt across the state with the classifications? Is it building the Fort Kent program from scratch? Is it the string of success you guys had throughout your tenure as the soccer coach? What do you look back on, and what are you most proud of during your time?
Oh, I'm just proud of the kids coming out of there and being the kind of people that they were once they exited the program. You know, a lot of the leaders in Fort Kent today are kids that played on my soccer team. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the winning streak we had there in the early late '60s and early '70s, where we won, or we had a streak of 72 games in a row without a loss.
Oh, wow.
66 wins and 6 ties during that streak, and I'm pretty proud of that because that's not something you see every day, you know.
Absolutely.
It takes a lot of hard work. So, no, I'm really proud of the time I spent in Fort Kent and the results of it all, and I wouldn't change a thing.
That's the best way.
Except maybe win a state championship. That's about the only thing. But that's, you know, those things happen or they don't happen. But just the time you spent with the kids and doing what you love to do, that was enough for me.
Absolutely.
It was good.
So we're just about to get up out of here. Is there anything that you want to say before we get up out of here? Is there any rumors you want to clear? Do you want to clear the air? Anything? Do you want to call anybody out? You can. It is your chance to say whatever you want before we get up out of here.
Well, I don't call anybody out at my age because it's, I'm just happy that I'm getting up in the morning and still breathing air, and I'm looking forward to the day. And so I just like to say to all the people in Fort Kent that I really enjoyed my time up there, and it did a lot of good things for me and my family. And I've got 2 great boys that grew up in Fort Kent, and the influence that the town had on them was nothing but positive. And those kids are doing real well today, and part of it's because of Fort Kent.
Absolutely. Well, Terry, I'm not going to hold you up anymore. I know it's a gorgeous day down there in southern Maine, so I'll let you enjoy the beautiful day down there. But I just want to thank you very, very much for coming on. Like I said, your name has been brought up a lot with some of the previous people I've had on the show. So just want to thank you once again for coming on and doing this. It was a lot of fun.
Well, no problem, Tom. I enjoyed it, and hope we both got something out of it.
That's going to do it for this week's episode. Make sure you're checking out all the previous episodes on iTunes, on Spotify, on YouTube. Make sure you're checking out the Big Time Classics on the YouTube channel. Make sure you follow us on social media, on Facebook and on Instagram at Big Time the Podcast. We'll put a bunch of fun stuff up on there. And also, for Season 4, if you guys could rate the podcast wherever you get it from. If it's on iTunes, give me 5 stars. Spotify, give me 5 stars. That's what we're going for here with Season 4. Thank you for listening. We will see you next time.